Hey Script Apart listeners, I hope you're all doing well on this frosty January afternoon. At least it's frosty where I am right now. I am shivering as I record this. My name's Al Horner, and today on this podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. Talk about setting the bar high for the rest of 2025. Nickel Boys, the new film by my guest today, RaMell Ross, may be one of the first releases of the year, but I can pretty much guarantee it's going to be still reverberating in my thoughts come the end of the year too. Adapted from a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by the author Colson Whitehead, Nickel Boys tells the story of a reform school for primarily black young offenders. A school where violence and cruelty are carried out and covered up against a backdrop of a rapidly changing America. Directed by RaMell from a script that he penned with co-writer Jocelyn Barnes, it is devastatingly a true story of sorts. Whitehead based the Nickel Academy in his story on a real-life institute called the Dozier School. In 2010, an investigation into the Dozier School uncovered a 111-year history of beatings, rape, torture, and murder of students by staff. 55 unidentified bodies in unmarked graves were discovered on the premises, with more than 100 children in total thought to have been killed on site. In Colson's story and RaMell's adaptation, a beautiful friendship is somehow able to begin amid the horror and the injustice of that environment. The film uses a unique first-person point-of-view camera to show the deep bond that blooms between these two boys, Elwood, played by Ethan Heresy, and Turner, played by Brandon Wilson. Jumping between perspectives and indeed timelines, with Daveed Diggs playing an older version of one of these characters, haunted by what he survived, the film moved me in ways it's hard to describe here. As did my spoiler conversation with RaMell, in which we discussed the film's delicate, remarkably truthful visualization of memory. We get into the meaning of the crocodile that stalks the backdrop of some scenes in this film, and why the film juxtaposes the terror of what's happening at Nickel with the beauty of outer space through NASA footage of the atmosphere as America wins the space race. This was a wonderful conversation to be a part of. A massive thank you to RaMell for being a brilliant guest, and a big thank you, as ever, to our Patreon supporters, without whom this show could not go on. If you like what we do on Script Apart and want to see us continue to grow, for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you can get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and access to our weekly writing hour. All you need to do is head to patreon.com/scriptapart. That address one more time is patreon.com/scriptapart. Or alternatively, if you want to support us in a different way, making some noise about us on social media, leaving a review, or simply telling a friend is a great way to help Script Apart continue to build an audience. Okay, I'll leave the introduction there. Let's get into it with the brilliant RaMell Ross discussing the first draft secrets of Nickel Boys. A massive thanks to all you guys for tuning in. This episode was produced as ever by Camille Demek. My name's Al Horner. Appreciate you listening, everyone. Enjoy the show. RaMell, thanks for joining us, and thank you for this incredibly moving film. When you were first approached about Nickel Boys, you've described hesitating. Can I begin by asking what it was about Nickel Boys that gave you that moment of needing to think hard about whether this was a project that you could and should take on? I'd love to hear if there was something in particular that daunted you about this story and how you then worked through it.
Well, thanks for having me, of course. I think the process of working with a studio system in general causes hesitation. I think for someone like myself who has particularly worked relatively alone and, doesn't have to, consult a ton of people with creative decisions. And specifically then reading Colson's narrative, it's a book that's a well-known story and told in a profound and kind of genre-changing way, but being unsure the degree to which the studio would be open for the way in which I would like to do it. And one should jump at opportunities because you don't know if they're going to come again, but you wonder if you can get trapped in maybe a turnstile of an opportunity and and leave in the same direction you came.
Yeah. Well, there were two things to respond to there. Like, number one, that all sounds quite fitting because for different reasons, Colson has described initially not being sure that he wanted to tell the story, but he said he felt compelled to. So there's a certain symmetry in your experiences as the two tellers of this tale. I guess the second thing to say is like, I've read you describe how, like, in general, you were quite a hesitant creator. And it was quite liberating reading that, RaMell, because I often see my own hesitancy as a writer as kind of a failing, like it's a lack of decisiveness or something. But hearing that it's part of your general process makes me think that actually there's a case to be made that hesitancy makes you a better storyteller who moves with consideration and control. You're not being swept up in anything, you're not just jumping at opportunities. So, yeah, do you feel like it benefits you? Do you feel like it's a superpower in a way?
I've never associated anything super with that, aside from depressing, maybe super depressing. Now, I do love that we're connecting over that because it's, it's contradictory almost to everything you hear. If you're gonna be a writer, you gotta write every day. You gotta get up, you gotta write. It's like I'm not Rocky. Like, what do you mean? Like I'm not, but maybe I should be. Maybe there's, we know that the processes of art and output and tapping the creative well and or going through the motions and like a muscle memory way with integrity. Like all of these are different and apply to people in different ways. But I've never felt that it was a quote unquote superpower, but I will say that I think it's been a relief to be able to acknowledge that I don't want to make everything and I'm not interested in making for the sake of making, but I love making as doing, but it's not something that I like to tell my students, just because you make it doesn't mean people need to see it. Just because you do it doesn't mean someone needs to know about it. We, I don't know if we're in an oversharing time. I'm not capable of making these like grand claims, but I think being hesitant to make stuff has given me the ability to have a life and genuinely indulge in it as a kind of a labor of love and a sort of privilege, or I can like almost idealize it in a way that I think brings great positive sensations.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of positive sensations, one of the remarkable things about Nickel Boys that I think I'll carry with me for a long time is the kind of storytelling language that it finds for memory. So, kind of most obviously in the film's subjective POV camera, but also in the way that scenes are presented in these little shards of recollection, sometimes with details missing. I came out the film thinking about how so many of my childhood memories are rooted in something sensory, like the touch or feel or sound of something. And in this film, entire scenes cling to the way that a knife cuts through cake, or, the way that a magnet slowly slides down a fridge and the memory attached to that. That's so close to what memory really is, but I haven't seen that on screen before. How did you arrive at that? And why was it important with this story to go beyond, like, here's a flashback?
Man, you saying that in deep tie with the very silky, sensation-filled um, tones of your voice is like so interesting. You have a very nice cadence. Um,
Thanks, man. It's the chamomile tea I'm drinking right now.
um, I think I learned I built my sensitivity or I built my sensibility around the camera and the sensory processes relationship to it from making this film Hell County this morning, this evening. And it really taught me about myself. It was a film that was about looking for eternity and trying to make meaning and trying to explore. existence and race in that huge sweep in the tiniest details, you know? Like what's the imaginative capacity of myself in this moment trying to be present with the camera and myself in this community within a historical context. Unanswerable, unattainable questions, but being sensitive to myself as a sensory being and the way in which the camera was reproducing the things that I thought I knew and was teaching me in new ways. And I think with that as a blueprint, I found I found that camera language is not hasn't been suited to deal necessarily with the complexity of race in society. You know, I'm unsure if this comes from something Godfrey Reggio, a filmmaker who made this series called the Kati trilogies, had said one time, I think in making his first film, that linguistic language is incapable of dealing with the complexity of humans in like a post-capitalist society, which made me think about the failures of language in general to deal with some of these also more complex things, given the way in which we hear a word and we think we know what someone means, then we go on, we like access our experience to the thing and are most often not open to new challenging versions of what stuff or could be or what stuff could mean. And taking that into camera language, it's like coming to the conclusion that I wanted to make the camera an organ and have it be as authentically iterating a person's point of view one to one as it is to be in my own head seemed to me something that necessitated this type of sensory process or this type of trying to get to the sensory through the camera and through films. And so long story short, I'm still working it out.
Yeah, it is strange. Like it's both radical and at the same time like surprising, if anything, that we haven't seen more of this in narrative storytelling. Like the only thing that occurs to me that I've seen it before in is like the TV show Peep Show that I don't know if you've experienced before, but very different to Nickel Boys, obviously.
Yeah, I like that I haven't. I read something on Twitter because I like try to read all the stuff just to see what people are talking about. Someone was like, I don't see what the big deal is. It's just like Peep Show. And I was like, what's Peep Show? And I go like look it up and I'm like, that's so crazy. Even Jomo, who is like knows all about point of view across cinema and stuff, like no one had ever mentioned Peep Show to me. You know, I'd never heard of it until after like I was reading that Twitter response.
Well,
Yeah.
hopefully over the festive break you'll have a chance to watch it, and the next time we talk, we'll have a big conversation about a guy called Super Hands. Um,
That's funny.
anyways, there is this really interesting tension in the film, Ramel, in that like the atrocities at the Nickel Academy, they're happening parallel to so much kind of like, well, quote unquote progress, both in terms of like the civil rights movement and more broadly as a species in the space race, like humanity conquering the moon. The fact that such terrible abuse could be occurring under the cover of such positive change, it feels quite pointed. So much so that, you know, you end the film that way, juxtaposing the beauty of NASA footage of outer space with photo evidence of the terrors that these Nickel Boys had to endure. Is there anything that you wanted to say about today and the ability of like injustice and racial injustice in particular to continue in the shadows, even in times where we as a people might kid ourselves that we're past it? Or was there kind of a different reason to thread that all into the movie?
I think the reason is spot on. I think that the sensory relationship between the two is a different thing. I think that, you know, being in Hell County, Alabama in like 2009 when I moved was like immediately slapped in the face with the the truth, I would say, for lack of a better word, about time in general and what history means when you're in a place that has geographically, architecturally not changed at all, but yet the people are driving Teslas and they have iPhones, but there's a house that's built in the 1700 like time is different when the only thing that's changed are, the language we use around the internet or the internet. It's a bizarre tension. And so I think I in reading this novel, one thing that Jocelyn Barnes, my co-writer, and I became aware of is, and she was alive during, the 70s, and sh the relationship between being a kid and having those extremes, right? Like I just can't imagine and trying to produce some iteration of like touching grass for the first time and feeling the sun on your skin and feeling an orange and then like realizing that it's juicy on the inside and you can eat it. Just all of these human things that you experience for the first time as a child, and then seeing this technology that you're mentioning and human beings floating outside of anything that's familiar in this new world that is just so unfamiliar yet becoming familiar, and then having a cane poked in your stomach, and that psychological incompatibility of ideas, like what does that produce in someone's head? Like what that to me would produce the capacity for someone to be, by all societal standards, crazy, and to not to like believe in conspiracy theories and to think that there are ghosts walking around, and maybe there are, but like it lends itself to unstable thinking. It's like a core contradiction between one's body and oneself, and what one sees, what one hears, and then how one's seen by others. And I think we wanted to try to, yeah, give someone that psychologically.
Yeah, it's so effective. So to go through some of the beats from the film itself, RaMell, like I guess first and foremost, who was Elwood to you and how did you choose to introduce him in this story?
Well, I think the thing that Jocelyn and I wanted to do primarily was maintain Coulson's characters. Like that, when we distilled the book, we found that the relationship between Hattie and Elwood, Hattie and Turner, Elwood and Turner, that's the whole book, you know. Um, while there's tons of peripheral slash primary characters, if we could satisfy a powerful relation between those, um, we felt that people could really be engaged in the poetry that we want to offer, um, and not be lost basically in it. And in thinking about Elwood, it's seemed like such an opportunity to explore how one goes through the world and becomes visually racialized, how they began to see people see themselves and see others be treated, through images that are like multivalent so that they don't read as, an illustration of a person, seeing a racial abuse happen and, oh no, I'm a black person, that's going to happen to me, but where they happen in oblique ways, where they happen in in glimpses and in shards. And I love how you opened talking about memory and the sensory and the impressions and the after image that is mainly what I think exists in the mind as it relates to the past. I think because this film, which I'm sure you know, is kind of deeply involved in the language of cinema and photography. And I'm unsure at this point with in my relationship to photography, if photography is even a good thing for the brain, or if film is even a good thing for the brain. And I say that not being a scientist and just always trying to work conceptually with understanding this technology, which is highly understood. We used to think people thought in images. Like we don't even know the language of the mind, yet we're placing these trees, these totem poles of images of people that are flat that we can go back to, when it seems like our mind is more interested in not that. Seems like our mind has been more interested evolutionarily in these things that you were talking about when you first opened the conversation. And so taking Elwood through the sensory process of that while also being in the language of photography, while experiencing race and culture, was something we wanted to do to build his character up into the point that he got to Nickel.
One of the moments early on in the film when I realized that I was watching something unlike I'd seen before was with the appearance of the crocodile, which, of course, like makes a certain narrative sense in the location of where Elwood's growing up, but the crocodile will come back in a less narratively easy to explain way later on in the film. There's a certain lyricism and kind of dreamlike quality to the crocodile's presence. Can you tell me about like that image and yeah, whether there was meaning ascribed? I loved how like, the crocodile is unexplained, and that was the moment I kind of realized how the film was trading in memory. These weren't flashbacks that were going to give you the context for why you're seeing certain images. That's not how memory works.
I love the idea of trading in memory. It's like you almost have, like baseball cards or basketball cards or something like memory cards, and you're just like with your friends at the lunch table, and you're like, "Yo, give me that memory. I'll give you this one." It's really interesting. Yeah, I think what a joy it was to convince everyone that healthy and strategic ambiguity in a narrative that's well known pays dividends in expanding our understanding of a person in familiar narratives. You would think that it makes things more confusing when in fact, I believe that it highlights the complexity of reality and our desire to just really understand to the point of misunderstanding. Um, the crocodile, I remember maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I'm sorry, 3 or 4 years before starting or getting the book Nickel Boys and reading that black children were used as alligator bait in the historic South. And it just kind of blowing my mind, especially because the more research I did, realized that it was like a mainstay practice, and that's how they would get alligators for meat and for skin. And and in that, I the amount of history that had been lost, I think, and the amount of horror that had been suppressed, I think really came to the forefront. And it's pretty almost shitty that it took that and me being 30 something to to really consider how much history had been lost in time, but that wasn't something that people had shared with me or people knew, was pretty devastating. And in this film, then the alligator, because we could make it be, which it was supposed to be for all the images, not be strictly a symbol or strictly a metaphor. It was something that was local, like you said, and an irresistible, use of the surreal, which is just the real, but speaks to the hyper reading that happens when you're raced, or the hyper literacy that happens when you're anything from any other place and you're forced to contend with multiple narratives of yourself, the double consciousness of yourself in whatever social situation. You read things other people don't read. You read omens. But are they omens or are they not? Are they omens because you know them, or are they not omens because they're just something? And it's so fun to play with, yeah, human interpretation.
It's then that we get to the Nickel Academy, which of course, like in the novel, was based on a real life site, the Dozier School. I'd love to ask about like yeah how you approach the geography of this place, the sort of physical aspects, the physical dimensions of the Nickel Academy. Colson Whitehead didn't go to the site of the Dozier School. He said he intended to, but he felt too much dread, too much anger. Did you
Mm.
have to go, Ramel, or did you swerve that like Colson did?
Oh, I swerved. I actually did plan to go as well. And I want to say ran out of time, but I also don't believe in running out of time. If something's a priority, then you make it a priority. I guess in some horrible cases, it actually becomes inevitable that you won't be able to do something that you could have made time for. But the idea of going to Dozier, it seemed actually unimportant because of the amount of information that was out there about it. I think there's something about being burdened by history in a way in which can be unproductive in the creative process. And there's also something to be said that you can be in the creative process and be in relationship with history to the point where you're not able to actually pay dividends to the truth because you're not viscerally involved with it. And I don't know which one, I don't think this is the case. Either of these are the case for my relationship and Joss's relationship to the story, but it didn't seem necessary in the same way that um, it didn't seem necessary to talk to the Dozier School living survivors, if that's one way to call them. Um, yeah, I think there's, yeah, having an uncapped, imaginative space armed with a lot of information was what we were kind of going for. The film itself, in the recreation of, and not even recreation, in the imaginative fabrication of the grounds, was one that's only is truly geared towards cinema, right? And geared towards where our cameras are going to be and how we're going to have this scene happen and allow you to get a good layout for the organization of buildings to give you a feel that you're in the place. Um, One thing that we tried to stay as true to heart to was the site of horror, which was the White House. It was the largest build. Actually, no, Nora Mendez, who was our production designer, quite an incredible artist. The boxing arena was a really tough build because that was all from scratch, like in this warehouse in New Orleans. But the White House, I think, was the most structurally sound and the most viscerally uh, accurate. So much so that I remember when Brandon and Ethan Harisi and Brandon Wilson, who played Elwood and Turner, came to where we were shooting for the first time. I took them to the White House and I asked them when they thought it was built, and they like did their cursory evaluations and both guessed upwards of like 60 to 40 years ago. um and I asked some of the other extra nickel boys and everyone was far off because Nora had finished it 3 days before. Like that's how ingrained it felt in the landscape. And kudos to her skill and her crew to make that happen. And that was kind of the core. Like if we could make that feel real than everything else, because that was that looming center site of why this film in some way existed. I felt true.
You almost couldn't make it up, the fact that the real life building was called the White House in a story about like this American sin, this American sort of stain on like the nation's history. Like the irony of that being the name of that building is quite wild.
Mm, I agree. It's almost like you said or implied, laughable, and you would not write that in a script because it would be a Saturday Night Live quip, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
So it's at this point during the film that you start to like fold in these cutaways to older Elwood, which it's really interesting visually to start off with. Like you shoot him in a way where we're forever watching his shoulders, and it seems to imply the weight that exists on those shoulders. It's also curious that I think the name of the removals company he works for is Ace, which is one of the tiers at Nickel Academy. That's when you graduate. I know that's something that you inherited from the book, but like the kind of the way you framed Elwood, older Elwood, that's something of your own invention. Can you talk to me about like this thread of the film and how you made all these decisions?
That was a detail we wanted to keep because how trauma true is the slippage of that under the radar of trauma, to become your company name. Like that almost embodies or represents the brilliance of Colson's narrative, in that his ecosystem of meaning and the way in which he like produces this mythology, uh obviously in service of the Dozier School boys, is so tightly woven and playful, yet visceral and devastating and accessible, but also like confusing. Like it's so it's so rich in that way that some of the best literature is. Um, we came to the Jomo Frey and I, who's the director of photography, came to that camera choice very late in, actually not so late, maybe a fourth of the way through the shot listing process. And the shot listing process is the process that is taken from the script, which was very, very, very rigorous. And, the original had camera movement and all the images were already in there, which kind of gave us a really good head start to actually start concentrating on the subtext of the visuals as opposed to the visuals themselves. I think that, yeah, I like to think that if you have a rigorous blueprint that, as Jomo would say, then you could do jazz in between the walls, but without that structure, you're trying to build the structure. And when we came across the future, the moments that you're talking about with adult Elwood, we realized that the camera language could not be the same as the quote unquote present for Elwood and Turner. One, because it would be confusing, we think, for the audience, and we'd have to overset design to change the time periods. But secondly, it wouldn't be authentic to, if we're making the camera an organ and it's inside of the body and you're using the camera as an extension of consciousness, Turner's consciousness, adult Elwood's consciousness, is fundamentally changed after Dozier. And this film is about the camera language being an expiration or a manifestation, a form, an extension of that. And, he mentioned um, the Snorri cam, which is typically used on the front of the body. And you've seen it in Requiem for a Dream and like Jonah Hill shots in Wolf of Wall Street or something. And it immediately made sense to put that on the back to one, assist in Colson Whitehead's the mysterious nature of who that figure is, or the lack of clarity of who that figure is, or the feigned clarity of who the character is. And more so, it became a way to express what happens when you have an outer body experience and when you get to see yourself going through the motions when you're disconnected from your body. And man, was that a huge sort of breakthrough in the form of the film, because it gave us an easy and accessible way to have a visual collapse of the future and the past when Elwood is shot. Um, Man, were we thrilled when that happened.
I mean, you started this conversation talking about like wanting to make this film the way you wanted without studio interference. And I don't know, when we think about like the miracle of this film, like the fact that you managed to shoot probably on paper one of the biggest stars in the film completely from behind, barely showing his face until the very end is
Yeah.
an amazing thing you managed to pull off. I should talk also about like the sort of many vignettes that occur when we're with Elwood and Turner at the Nickel Academy. One of them is the incident involving the young black boxer who's instructed to throw a fight by one of the Nickel Academy administrators. And I've been thinking about that scene ever since, trying to work out like whether it was, when I first watched it in the moment, I thought it's an act of defiance that we're seeing. But then, of course, at the end of the scene, he's claiming that he like miscounted the rounds. I'm curious, like how you saw that scene and the sort of truth that you understood involving that moment.
Yeah, I like that you're asking that question because Griff is played by this really talented actor, Luke Tenney, and he asked that exact question the first time I saw him. We cast him based on a tape. I think we had a quick conversation with him over Zoom, and in person, you know, hey, RaMell, very nice to meet you. Like, thanks so much for, the role. About Griff, just like immediately goes in. And I think I'm mentioning that because I like just deeply appreciate his rigor. And it's not the largest role in the world for him. He's had way more screen time in other works, but like he brought uh some sort of authenticity, for lack of a better word. And I don't even know what authenticity means, but he brought something to the character that is not direction. Like it's not me. I'm not shaping him to be this person. Like he really, really took the character and what Colson had wrote, specifically at this moment you're talking about in the boxing match, seriously. Like I think we talked about Griff getting carried away, right? Like when you're when you're better than others at something, you tend to not get to the point, you know? You tend to mess around, you tend to indulge, you tend to enjoy the moment. And in this context, when, race has determined their fates in deeply explicit ways, and you have an opportunity to, inflict some pain. And when it is actually less about you inflicting pain and you being a than you being a vessel for your community to inflict pain, you know, what happens in that moment? Do you put a little bit more into one of your punches just to hurt him just a little bit more before you get to the point where you realize you need to make sure that you survive this charged interaction? And I think we talked a lot about that and about how forgetting is not always obliviousness. Sometimes it's postponed remembering, and what happens when uh, the universe and emotion and what it means to be a sensory being um, takes hold of what is normally a cognitive moment.
I think we got time for just one more question, RaMell. So let me ask you this. Just like how there was a sentimental version, a sensationalized Hollywood version of that scene that we were just discussing that could have been made, I think the same can be said about the death at the climax of this movie. Like, on paper, that's an emotional moment of heroic sacrifice that you can imagine being really milked for its emotion in another filmmaker's hands, but you don't play it that way necessarily. Like, there's a lot of emotion in it, but there's also ambiguity and dreaminess and a sense of eroded memory. Can you tell me about that scene, the ending of the film, and yeah, how you wanted to bring Elwood and Turner's stories to a conclusion?
I think at the outset of the writing process, Jocelyn and I began to write, of course, or imagine what the layout and the emotional beats of the film would be. And you imagine almost immediately how it should be done or how it has been done. And you think about the organization of the film's language and the relationality between characters to have the most impact when Elwood dies, like so that it is a horrible thing and the audience is, oh my God, this lovely kid. And we decided to take the opposite approach. In that other version, you also have that death be something that is explosive. Um, but our approach became, okay, how can we, if the idea is to give the Dozier School boys life, how do we postpone Elwood's death as long as possible and organize the act of looking and the scenes around a sort of lethargy and a sort of um, presentness that postpones his death as long as possible? With that being said, and with the idea of violence, visual violence, or the execution of visual violence not being the language of the film, we I, I even hesitated showing him blurry in the background getting shot. But it actually became a problem in which, because the film is not, it leaves so much open to analysis and interpretation. There was a version that if we did not see Elwood shot and we did not see him lying on the ground and looking up and kind of going blurry, then you might not know that he died. And then that would actually disrupt the narrative that we wanted. And so the approach for that scene was actually about that moment being more about Turner than it being about Elwood. And that seems a bit almost unfair to Elwood, who the film is at least half about on the surface. But as Elwood dies, he essentially takes takes place in Turner's body. The camera pops out of Turner, Elwood is inside of him. And so we then realize we'll approach it more of a transference, and he'll carry him forth. And this is Colson's narrative. But we wanted to do it sort of visually, and yeah, and of course, then just fall into this like gorgeously emotional visual cascading, like the swimming with images of Turner's psychological observation, like his inner life. Like, man, I love that montage so much. I'll tell you before we go, the montage was the first thing that was written, and with Tizata, and I made an edit of the montage because we had our archival producer, Allison Brandon, working to pull images already. Yeah, and then we knew if we could get to the montage, then we kind of had a film.
Well, it's such a beautiful ending and a great place to leave this conversation. RaMell, thank you so, so much.
Thank you, Al.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.